So in this segment, we're going to be talking about this article by Bob Hank about how the TCA constrains Brexit Britain and can prevent a lot of the deregulation. So we spoke previously in another video about how Lord Frost aims to deregulate the UK, but he's also having to abide by parts of the TCA which talk about a level playing field. And that's kind of the minefield that Brexiteers are going to have to walk through, at least government Brexiteers, because they can deregulate, but if they do deregulate too much in certain places, they can be hit with tariffs from the EU, for example. So if we look at what Mr. Bob has written, he said reports on a recent study which suggests not only that the agreement has made trade in goods between the UK and the EU very difficult, but that it has also severely limited Britain's ability to conclude free trade agreements with the rest of the world, because there is that issue of a level playing field. And what that means is if we do start importing hormone treated beef from Australia, that means there are going to be more checks and potentially tariffs on UK beef. It'd be more checks really, because you're going to have to check the rules of origin. You know, did this beef come from Australia? Yes. What were the farms that produced it? Things like that. So they wrote about some of the problems of the TCA in a previous Europe post in July. But one aspect seems to have eluded many observers. The UK can, of course, conclude free trade agreements with countries beyond the EU, as it has done since the TCA entered force. You know, New Zealand, Japan, we're going to be working on the Canada one at some point, and a few others. However, it cannot do so without large repercussions on UK-EU trade, which makes sovereign free trade agreement negotiating extremely difficult, because if the UK signs up to agreements that are sort of deregulated from the standards that the EU has, that's where problems can arise. The reason is simply that the UK is forced to abide by standards and norms set in Brussels for the free movement of goods and even services. The services one is quite interesting because we only have equivalency in some areas until 2022. So they talk about clearinghouses here and financial stability. Should have highlighted all of that bit really, but you can see there it talks about financial stability and risk, and that is why in September 2020 the Commission adopted a time-limited equivalence decision for the UK CCPs until the 30th of June 2022 to avoid such a cliff-edge scenario for clearinghouses and things like that. So the EU can pull the rug from under those if they want to, but we'll see if anything moves on that. So the below takes a closer look at the three areas to explore different dimensions of the problem: labour and environmental standards, agriculture and food product standards, and in trade and digital services. So these are the three key aspects they've picked out. So in the TCA, the UK is committed to maintaining labour and environmental standards that are broadly equivalent to those of the EU. So the issue here is that the UK has higher standards than the EU's basement level. So the UK can deregulate worker standards, but there is that EU basement kind of level that we can't go underneath that. Wages and working conditions should be deemed to be broadly equivalent, which again, that's subjective. Though it is unclear who exactly will make that call, probably the ECJ, I'd assume, if it goes to court. And recent noises about suppressing the ECJ's role in those processes would make the situation more and not less complicated. Again, if the ECJ is not going to rule on it, then who will? Because the EU aren't going to let outside courts deal with it when it goes to EU, when it's about EU law. Similarly, the environment credentials of exported UK products will be evaluated by the EU and vice versa, though very few observers see that as a problem. But then again, it's unclear who will be involved in that process, because there's a lot of ambiguity there on purpose, because it gives actors a lot of leeway. And if you look at the environmental credentials, we've talked previously twice about how the oceans are being pumped with raw sewage, and also Britain's rivers, and that's going to affect things like shellfish from grade B waters that might be relegated to grade C waters, and other kinds of fish that are going to be feeding off, the human waste that is going into the rivers and the oceans. This lack of clarity regarding the enforcement mechanisms is not nearly as helpful as militant Brexiteers would like it to be, since it introduces a degree of political discretion, so it does give the EU leeway to act more than if it was written down in hard text. Into an area that usually ruled by soft and hard law to avoid trade becoming a political football. So there is discretion on the EU's part and the UK's part, which can be an issue depending on who you're dealing with. But there's more. The condition of broadly equivalent labour and environmental standards as a prerequisite for tariff-free trade makes the pursuit of an export-based model, primarily on cost competitiveness, the main viable short-term strategy for an economy with a highly deregulated labour market and a persistent productivity problem impossible. So if we look at that, if the UK can't follow an export model, that's not what we're really trying to do here. Most of the trade deals are for optics, really, but we can't follow an export model because our working conditions and wages are too high, combined with a shortage of labour, skilled labour specifically, which means manufacturing's at a standstill. Not to mention the fact that we've lost our main export partner, the EU. So that makes us even less attractive as an export market. Really, we can't really export goods. We're not built like that. We haven't been built like that since Thatcher and I think a bit of Tony Blair killed manufacturing, decades ago. The reason it would make less sense for most companies that export to the EU to develop a parallel lower regulation model to export to the rest of the world. So there is that thing where some countries have two different kind of conveyance line, two different manufacturing lines. One for sort of the higher up markets, so the EU, and one for the lower end markets, say the USA or other kind of global south countries that have lower standards than the EU. All things being equal, the company is better off adopting the same standards everywhere, since higher standards will never violate the lower standards, but that is not true the other way around. And I think in California, if they implement things like car safety rules, what happens is all the other all the car manufacturers implement those high California standards, because it's not worth having two manufacturing lines. It's not worth their time. It costs a lot of money, and your products are more likely to get checked because you have a lower quality production line and a higher quality production line. EU standards thus impose important extraterritorial constraints, in the sense that their effects can be felt outside the territories explicitly covered by its rules. So what they're saying is that these UK companies will most likely not create two systems, or two lines, one for the EU and one for the non-EU countries. UK companies exporting to the US or Australia, the two leading contenders for free trade agreements. Let's not forget here that these two countries will export way more to the UK post-trade deal than they are now. We'll have to do so continuing to adopt the cumbersome and uncompetitive EU labour and environmental standards, assuming that we don't want to lose the lucrative EU markets, because that's the key here, really. We don't want to lose the EU market, but we also want to get the Australia and US market. So what that means is, if we start deregulating within the country, these companies are going to have a massive advantage exporting to us, whilst we will not have an advantage exporting to them, because we're going to be essentially constrained by the higher tier EU rules, because that's where more the money is. A similar problem emerges in product standards, where the TCA's internal logic produces a direct and very sharp dilemma for the UK. The UK faces a relatively simple choice. It can stick to EU standards to preserve trade with European counterparts, or the countries can adopt different standards to facilitate new free trade deal agreements with non-EU countries. And the thing is, even if we keep our standards high, but make trade deals with other countries with lower standards and accept those lower standard goods, it's going to mean more checks, more SPS checks and other kinds of checks on the borders. In the latter case, however, the UK runs a significant risk of cutting off its companies from the European single market as a result. The oft-cited case of US beef illustrates the problem. The UK can negotiate a free trade deal with the US in which hormone-treated beef can be freely traded. In exchange, one would guess, for free US access by UK products such as whiskey, but hormone-treated beef is prohibited in the EU. Once the US-UK agreement is signed, if it's signed, and ratified, therefore, those parts of the TCA between the EU and the UK that deal with beef exports and imports are effectively suspended. Now, that again, I don't know if that's 100% true, because the EU can increase checks on meats and things going into the single market to make sure they weed out any kind of American hormone-treated beef. If beef can travel freely between the US and the UK, and between the UK and the EU, there is no way for the latter to stop the import of hormone-treated beef, which goes against the current EU regulatory framework. And again, rules of origins and labelling will be a huge problem as well, because if the US do anything dodgy and say that, we don't want any labels to say this stuff's from America, then that's going to make basically meat exports from the UK to the EU almost impossible. because the EU aren't going to know where this stuff's coming from. Suspension of trade is the only possible answer to avoid breaking EU laws, unless the UK pre-exempts that by adapting EU constraints when negotiating a free trade agreement with the US. But the problem is, if we do hold EU constraints while negotiating a free trade deal with America, we're not going to get a free trade deal with America. Again, the EU's constraining power is felt in areas where the EU is not directly involved, which is true. The TCA holds the UK to certain standards. Also, the fact that we can keep our tariff-free access, but if we start doing anything dodgy and start lowering regulations, that's when tariffs can kick in. It's really up to the EU. While the digital trade section in the TCA is as best in class, its success is largely contingent on the EU's data adequacy decision. Non-EU member states must be afforded data adequacy to store and process the data of EU citizens. Although the UK secured a positive decision from the EU Commission, this is limited to 4 years, after which the EU will re-evaluate the equivalence of data protection mechanisms. And this again is another area where Lord Frost specifically has mentioned deregulation. So that could cause a huge problem for UK companies, mainly websites I think, and data collection companies. The expiration date and the Commission warning that they could revoke the decision at any point if data was not accurately protected gives the EU further leverage. Because if the UK gives any hint of deregulation, boom, your equivalency deal is gone. Regulators in Brussels will monitor any attempt to change the UK protection legislation carefully, thus limiting the UK's ability to deregulate a policy area that is growing in importance and is likely to find a new place in new free trade agreements, because data is worth a lot of money. If things go wrong, the UK will have to choose between the EU approval by sticking to its standards or foregoing the benefit of digital trade with the EU in favour for trade elsewhere. So if the UK starts deregulating, they will effectively have to choose between the EU and the rest of the world. And it won't even be the rest of the world, it will be a few countries in the rest of the world that we can get trade deals with. Either way, the loss is entirely asymmetric and the EU can unilaterally decide to impose restrictions. Any moment they can do it. They don't really need a massive justification. So we go on to the final bit, which is these three areas suggest that the UK has painted itself into a corner with the TCA by explicitly remaining outside the single market. The country has not only thrown up a whole host of regulatory and governance problems, such as Northern Ireland and the ECJ, or economic difficulties, empty supermarket shelves, and a lack of lorry drivers, but it's also made itself vulnerable to the extraterritorial powers of the EU, that we are constrained by EU laws whether we like it or not, even though we're not in the single market or the customs union. The EU-UK trade deal depends on the UK adopting EU standards. If the UK were to negotiate a free trade deal with a third country that violates EU standards, the EU can suspend parts of the TCA that govern free trade in these markets, would reimpose tariffs on, impose tariffs on the UK on certain goods, making those agreements with the US pointless. With significant losses for UK businesses and potentially the economy as a whole. Avoiding these problems means choosing the lesser evil between the EU-related losses and non-EU-related losses gains in trade. The size of the EU and the weight of the UK's trade basket almost inevitably leads to one conclusion for the now sovereign UK: minimise EU-related losses by adopting EU standards. But if we keep EU standards, we won't get trade deals with other countries. I'm 90% sure that trade deal with Australia hinges on us importing hormone-treated beef from Australia. And if we look at what Michael M put, no great science. It's simple. The more you converge on standards and tariffs, the easier the trade. Ultimates being a single market for standards and a customs union tariff to outsiders. As a country/market, you choose which market you want to trade with most. If we want to trade with the EU most, we have to hold their standards. If we want to trade with other countries, then we will probably have to deregulate, and then by de facto losing our trade with the EU. And if you look over here, this tweet from Barnier, which I remember quite well, this is before the agreement was signed, I believe. He had a short break from intense negotiations in London when looking for level playing fields. So the EU knew there was a chance the UK could deregulate at any point, and so the EU put in mechanisms so that if the UK does deregulate, the EU could hit back with tariffs. That's what the TCA allows them to do. It's one of the main reasons they ratified it in the end. So if the UK does decide to mess around, we'll find out. So this article is very long, a bit jargony, but it does kind of give out the key points, which is that the UK is constrained by the TCA and effectively EU law without really realising it, and there is a basement level we can't go past for EU rules, otherwise we're in trouble. Anyways, I'm going to leave it there. Let me know what you think in the comments below. Like, comment, share, subscribe, and hopefully I'll see you in the next one.